Hi everyone, this is April Ju, producer of this podcast, Until Everyone is Free. This is the next installment of an open-ended series we've called Beyond the Bill, which aims to take the political momentum from Maandamano last year and harness it using political education to help us understand why things are the way they are and how we might organize to change it. In late January, M23 rebels launched an offensive on Goma, the capital of North Kivu province in eastern DRC. The number of people who died from the beginning of the siege until February 24th, which is when DRC Prime Minister Judith Suminwa Tuluka reported the casualty count to the UN, had surpassed 7,000, and by now, needless to say, it is much more. By the time of M23's attack, Goma already housed 300,000 internally displaced people, many of whom lived in refugee camps, these vast, barren grids of white square tents. Upon occupying Goma, M23 expelled over a third of these internal refugees, many of whom had already been displaced multiple times and whose homes were burned long ago. The war in eastern Congo has raged for nearly 3 decades. During this time, over 7 million people have died. It is the deadliest war since World War II, and yet, even an event like the attack on Goma, in which more than 7,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed, makes only a blip on international headlines before the world continues on. We've said before on the podcast that Uhuru a Palestina ni Uhuru wetu, that when Palestine is free, we are all free because the occupation of Palestine is, quote, the heart of the beast. It is imperialism at its baldest. It is a colony that in 2025 has yet to exercise its right to self-determination. When Palestinian land is returned to Palestinian hands, it means the beast has been stabbed in its heart. In this episode, we want to not only explain the history of the long war in the DRC, but, more importantly, explain how this is true of Congo too. There's a reason Pan-Africanists have called DRC the heart of Africa. Why, as some sources claim, Kwame Nkrumah proposed the capital of the United States of Africa to be located in Kinshasa. It is not simply because Congo is in the geographical center of the continent. It is because, from the first industrial revolution to the fourth, Congo, which contains half of Africa's water resources, half of Africa's forest cover, and enough arable land to feed half of Africa, Congo reveals the darkest face of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. And a free Congo reveals a horizon for African self-determination and self-sufficiency that we've yet to reach. In Congo, we see the bottom of the chain of capitalism, the human suffering that makes possible not just consumerist life, but the current political world order. Congo's Shinkolobwe mine decided the result of World War II. Congo's independence threatened imperialists enough for them to turn the UN from a promising forum where newly independent countries in Asia and Africa could exercise real power against their former colonizers into a tool of those former colonizers, which, arguably, it remains today. Congo's natural resources and the Congolese laborers who extracted all past and present minerals used in the world have driven every single industrial revolution in human history. Congo has made the world. Congo has decided who in the world can hold on to power. In this episode, we want to talk about the war, but we also want to highlight Congolese resistance, past and present. And we want to look at the DRC not from the angle of a humanitarian crisis, which it most certainly is, but rather as a linchpin of Pan-Africanism. The slogan, Free Congo, has been used a lot, often by people who are unclear about what Congo needs to be freed from. But the slogan itself is important, it's urgent, and it's correct. We must understand who benefits from the oppression of the Congolese people. We must understand what Congolese resistance is underway. We must never settle for trite repetitions of slogans to simply assuage our own guilt, and we must never look away from the heart of Africa. And this is why. In the same way that the struggle for Palestinian emancipation is very clearly a struggle of the world's majority against a powerful minority, the struggle for Congolese emancipation will be too. If the emancipation of Palestine threatens the world's power as much as we've seen, and there is no doubt we must unite equally when Free Congo blooms from a slogan into a reality. It will be one of the most difficult battles to come, but it can only be fought with all hands on deck. And for that to happen, we need to be clear-eyed, especially us in East Africa, about what is happening in the DRC. Today, we are speaking to Ntaranya Jinja. Ntaranya has a research background in rehabilitation, reconciliation, and reintegration of former child soldiers in post-conflict communities using creative participatory mediums such as dance and film. As content director for #Congo Excellence, he worked on educational content for Congolese youth to nurture their potential to contribute to the development of the country. Ntaranya has also been the implementation support lead for the SOS Children's Villages Ombuds implementation project for West, Central, East, and Southern Africa regions, and has also worked with the Research Center, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, Kenya Scholars Access Program, Tuition Aid Data Services, and the immigration law company Rivero Law LLC. Before I get into the discussion, I'm going to provide a very, very, very brief history of the DRC and this current conflict. Much of this draws from the dossier recently published by the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research called The Congolese Fight for Their Own Wealth, and this was collaboratively produced by the Centre Culturel André Blouin, the Center for Research on the Congo Kinshasa, Likambo ya Mabele Land Sovereignty Movement, and Tricontinental. At the end of the episode, Ntaranya will make some more recommendations as well. In the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, when Africa was carved up by European powers, King Leopold II claimed the Congo, establishing what he called l'État indépendant du Congo, or Congo Free State. What was once a vast, fertile expanse made up of diverse agrarian communities was violently turned into a brutal plantation economy for groundnuts, palm oil, and, of course, rubber. The rubber plantations, which provided raw material for the Industrial Revolution in Europe, turned the lower Congo and areas in what is now Malebo Pool into a bloody butchery. A famous photograph taken by Alice Seeley Harris depicts an enslaved rubber plantation worker called Nsala, sitting on the ground, gazing blankly at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, Boali. The Anglo-Belgian Indian Rubber Company had cut them off and then killed both Boali and her mother because Nsala had not met his rubber quota for the day. Once, 1,308 severed hands were brought to the colonial commissioner in one day alone. The colony was handed over to Belgium in 1908, and the exploitation continued. In the 1930s and 1940s, Luba, Lunda, Chokwe, and other peasant communities were evicted off their land, just like those in Kenya for settler farms, which made it easy for big industrial firms to ally with local aristocrats or wealthy families to seize the land and force them to grow cash crops like cotton and sesame for capital accumulation rather than subsistence. Colonial subjugation was always met with Congolese resistance, which we'll speak more about in the present day later in our discussion. But from 1900, when the rubber-rich capital of Kasai, called Luebo, was taken back by Congolese, to the 1950 grassroots spiritual anti-colonial movement led by Maria Nkoi, to the 1931 Pende Uprising, to self-organized women's groups in cities in the 30s, to 1941 Kikole tin mine strikes, to the 1945 Force Publique mutiny, and many, many uprisings both in city and countryside throughout the 1950s. In 1958, the Congolese national movement was founded to fight for independence and a united Congo that served all of its diverse ethnic groups. Patrice Lumumba was one of its leaders. Belgium was losing control. In December 1958, Ghanaian Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah hosted the All-African People's Conference in Accra. Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, Jamal Nasser, and Sékou Touré were there, and from the Congo, Gaston Diomi, Patrice Lumumba, and Joseph Ngalula from the Congolese National Movement. This conference was a lightning rod for Pan-Africanism. It became clear that Congo could play a powerful role in networks of solidarity. And it was through these connections, for example, that André Blouin, a Ghanaian Pan-Africanist born in the Central African Republic, was sent by Lumumba to organize what would become the Feminine Movement for African Solidarity. In 1 month, 45,000 Congolese women had signed up, and these women, who had long been self-organizing on their own, played an important role in the anti-colonial struggle. On 30th June 1960, Belgium conceded independence to Congo, but the DRC never became truly independent. Less than half a year later, on 17th January 1961, Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. This was a UN-endorsed operation conducted by Belgium, France, and the CIA. The few months in between not only set Congo on the path towards where it is today, but the rest of the world. Belgium and the US could not allow Lumumba to set Congo on a path of self-determination, giving the Congolese people control over their natural resources. Why? The US had access, for example, to the Shinkolobwe mine that allowed it to build the atom bomb that delivered its World War II victory. The Cold War arms race hinged on control of these resources, which meant making sure the Soviet Union didn't find its way to them. So how would the US and Belgium undo Congo's independence? How would they get rid of Lumumba? The Oscar-nominated film Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat tells the story through archival footage and direct quotes, and I highly recommend it for anyone who wants a fuller picture of these key 6 months. But long story short, they found a puppet, a collaborator, called Moïse Tshombe. They paid him well, and in return, he led a secession movement separating the region of Katanga, where the Shinkolobwe mines and many other mineral resources lay, from the rest of the DRC. Katanga was basically a fake country where the real government was the mining company that continued to extract resources, business as usual, ensuring that control of the mines would never go to the independent Congolese government. But when Lumumba continued fighting and unified MPs behind him, even those who had been paid off by the US and Belgium realized they needed to take more drastic action. With the approval of US President Eisenhower and under the watch of UN peacekeepers, the Katanga military abducted Lumumba, dragged him to Katanga, and executed him. They backed a coup d'etat by Mobutu Sese Seko, who would rule until 1997. The promise of multi-ethnic Congolese unity under Lumumba faded fast. Under Mobutu, the state decayed, and with increasing intervention from Uganda and Rwanda, Eastern Congo plunged into war. In the instability, multinational companies increased their plunder. Let's turn our gaze now to Eastern Congo. Lake Kivu separates the DRC from Rwanda. Goma, which borders Rwanda, is on the north end of the lake, and Bukavu on the south. This region has always been home to Rwandaphone communities such as Hutus and Tutsis, as well as many other ethnic groups. And tensions between them have dated back to the colonial period. But under the Hutu-dominated Rwandan government, waves of ethnic violence against Tutsis in Rwanda throughout the 20th century caused waves of migration into eastern Congo. And of course, there were many Tutsis who were there before these colonial borders were even drawn. But this ethnic violence culminated in the Rwandan genocide in 1994. In about 100 days, Hutu militias systematically killed more than 800,000 people, a vast majority of whom were Tutsi. The genocide ended when the Tutsi rebel movement, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, took Kigali. Hutu militias fled into DRC with the assistance of France under Operation Turquoise. The current Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, who was once a military officer in the RPF, has been credited with transforming Rwanda after this devastating genocide, and the RPF remains the ruling political party in Rwanda under him today. It's easy to forget how large the DRC is, and as a result, how diverse it is, and how this can affect domestic politics. The distance from Goma to Kinshasa is approximately the same as that from Nairobi, Kenya, to Harare, Zimbabwe. Still, the complex dynamics of Eastern Congo have had a direct impact on politics in Kinshasa. Mobutu was ousted in 1997 by rebel forces led by Laurent Kabila, backed by the RPF. The following year, Rwanda invaded the DRC on the pretext that Tutsi people in the DRC were being killed by the Hutu militia in Interahamwe, who were also present there. On the other hand, Congolese officials responded to the invasion by inciting attacks on Tutsis within the DRC, which Rwanda also cited as grounds for intervention. War ensued, leaving over 7 million dead. While fighting officially ended in 2003 and Tutsi rebels were incorporated into the DRC's military in a process called mixage, problems did not end. Now enter M23. M23 stands for the March 23rd movement, established in 2012 by former officers of the Congrès National pour la Défense du Peuple, or CNDP. These officers were dissatisfied with the terms of a peace agreement with the Congolese government made on March 23, 2009, hence the name. In 2012, M23 captured Goma, but this rebellion ended in 2013 with the Nairobi declarations. However, in 2021, talks fell apart and M23 resumed fighting, gaining significant tracts of territory. It resurfaced in international attention because of the siege of Goma just recently. M23 claims to be securing Rwandaphone communities in eastern DRC, and though Kagame has repeatedly denied backing M23, the UN group of experts has reported the presence of 3,000 to 4,000 Rwandan soldiers in North Kivu fighting alongside M23. And there are many other sources that point to the fact that M23 would not have been able to expand its territory as it has without state support from Rwanda. The violence resulting from this war cannot be understated. I won't go into the details here, as Congo's suffering is much better documented by the media than the reasons for it, but to give you a sense of the devastation, just between January 2023 and May 2023, camps of internally displaced people, large enough to be visible by satellite, mushroomed around Goma, almost all around areas of high lava flow hazard. Although peace has not been possible to sustain during this period, what has been sustained and only deepened with time is the wholesale plunder of Congo's resources. Of course, these two things are inextricable. Many of the over 100 militias in eastern Congo are funded by controlling mineral supply chains. The soaring profits of mining companies has not suffered at all because of the instability of the region, if anything, the opposite. In 2023, the Anglo-Swiss mining company Glencore reported $3.5 billion in revenue before tax. These profits represent incredible value stolen from Congolese laborers, who are kept as low as possible on the capitalist chain of production, laboring in some of the most appalling working conditions on Earth, exposed to radioactive substances that cause lung cancer, fromage water that causes birth defects, and cobalt dust which causes hard metal lung disease, all under the force of violent militias. More than 40,000 of these laborers are children, some as young as 8 years old. This was according to UNICEF in 2014, so the number is almost surely higher now. The cell phone you may be holding or listening to this from, not just iPhones, but all smartphones, contains about 6.5 grams of cobalt. Every computer contains about 5 to 20 grams of cobalt. Cars, and especially electric cars, contain kilograms of cobalt. By 2018, 71% of the cobalt used in cell phones, computers, and electric cars in the world came from the DRC. There's a good chance that the cobalt that makes your screens light up was dug from a mine in the Congo by a man, or very likely perhaps even a child, with his bare hands. The world acts as if it owes the Congolese people nothing. Even when at least 7,000 people have died in just 2 months, the world struggles to lend even its fleeting attention. And yet, the reality is that we owe the Congolese people everything about our normal lives that they have been denied for decades. It can be paralyzing to even begin to confront this tragedy, let alone figure out how to change it. But it is important to begin here with this history to understand who caused it, who continues to benefit from it, and who suffers. Only then can we shift away from seeing Congo as a humanitarian disaster or some natural state of Africa, and instead begin seeing Congo as a necessary foundation for capitalist accumulation, capitalism working exactly as it should. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ntaranya. I had just begun with a very short history leading up to the current state that we see the DRC in today. And this sort of sped through history covers aspects that many have heard of, of course, foreign intervention, brutal exploitation, ethnic violence, and its political weaponization. But it is, of course, missing an important parallel history, one that I want you to share with us, which is that of Congolese resistance. So, could you begin by introducing us to some of the diverse movements and uprisings that have taken place?
Yeah, definitely. I think Congolese resistance and resilience would be a better way to term it, right? How do people are able to be resilient given what's going on? Um, I'll start outside and try to focus down into concentric circles until we get to the epicenter, right? And so you have the larger Congolese diaspora that resists and protests, whether that's online through Twitter Spaces and social media, but also at different in different countries at embassies of policymakers and global leaders, notably the French, the British, the U.S., and the Belgians, right? The protests have been held. A clear example is recently in Geneva, a protest was held towards ending the war in Congo and ending the conflict that's happening. If we come down to even more focused scale, you have protests that have happened by youth in general in Kinshasa, although those may be debatable given what the outcomes were of them. But protests have happened at embassies, have happened in terms of calling out Canal Place. One of the more notable ones before December was during the African Cup of Nations. Um, the Congolese team did protest against the violence and the killings that have been happening in the DRC, but this wasn't televised. It was seen in Ivory Coast when the match happened, but the broadcasting companies, the television companies, all tried to avoid the silent protest that the Congolese team had made, wearing black bands and everything, and had skipped over it. And so, in response to that, a number of youth across Congo did also go towards broadcasting channels like Canal Plus. But if we step even before that, there's groups like Lucha, which is a youth led group in Goma. That has been quite vocal in terms of protesting not only the war in Congo, but the political leadership and what it's doing, right? This has been as early as during Joseph Kabila's time. You have on the resilience side, or groups like Goma Active, right? And Goma Active has been quite notable in not only highlighting the killings that have been happening, the destruction, the damage, and protesting and being vocal against it, but also highlighting the work that's being done by community, right? So they've been very adamant on bringing youth and community to come and help internally and forcibly displaced people in DRC have access to food, to clothing, to technical skills to continue farming and reaching a subsistent level of farming for their own communities. And so those are things that I have access to, but there's a ton more. We can go all the way back to like 1960 with that as well.
Thank you so much for that. I think the note that you ended on, which is, in terms of things like agricultural production and just kind of daily life, this issue of
Hmm.
resilience, I think, is a good twin for this concept of resistance, because as
Hmm.
is clear from this very complex history, pretty much since the colonial period, the DRC has always been in a state of militarization of some sort.
Yes. Hmm.
And this affects almost every aspect of life. It, of course, affects Congolese ability to organize and to resist to begin with, but it also deeply affects domestic politics, agricultural or industrial production. It affects mobility. Obviously, it affects child welfare, with child soldiers, with whom I know you've worked in the past, and as well as mining conditions, all of these things. So I'll let you take this big question, whatever direction you'd like, but can you speak to what militarization means for everyday life in Congo and for Congolese ability to control their own lives.
Mm. I think it's almost a three-part in my perspective, right? I think the first part is that because DRC has been militarized and has had militia and rebels in the DRC for longer than I've been alive, it's normalized now, right? It's in a way that people sort of know what's the process of step one to 10. If you see a rebel group walk into your town, or you see the army walking into your town, or you see MONUSCO, like what are the steps you're supposed to take, right? And how do you evacuate? And that's unfortunate to say, but like even during this time, so I come from Bukavu. Bukavu is my hometown, right? And after the siege on Goma and when M23 took over Goma, they then went through North Kivu, came down to South Kivu and took over Bukavu. And even as that was happening, people already knew, like, okay, when they do come, this is what we're going to do, this is how you're going to proceed, and this is those steps are very clear that even my 17-year-old cousin knew about, right? And that's one aspect of it, the fact that it becomes for those living in it a new normal, right? And I would say that in some context, it'd be good to highlight that DRC is militarized to a certain extent and has a lot of military dynamics happening in it, but a lot of this happens within the southern and eastern belt of DRC, right? So you'd feel less of this if you go towards the west, Kinshasa and the likes. There's a bit more of what you'd say less militarization and more freedom of movement in that way. However, regardless of that, there's still a control and censorship that happens in terms of how you move. If you are dissident towards one party or another, there's going to be a way of trying to reach you through military or force in that way. Um, with that said, the challenge of the situation is the fact that then people aren't committed or aren't trusting in making a long-term investment in development, right? And so it kind of puts us into a catch-22, right? In order to stop the war, in order to stop the conflict, in order to stop the support for rebels, right, you need to provide an alternative where there's support, where there's an option for something that is better, right? Because a lot of the time we have the narrative of child soldiers and children of war being forced into being child soldiers, right? There's that pull where they're physically pulled into being child soldiers, right? But in that sense, and even in the mind, sometimes the pull is actually a push, right? That the life being provided to you in this rebel group, in this military, in quote unquote terms, presents a better life or better option than what you're currently receiving, because of the lack of support, because of the lack of investment, because of the lack of long-term thinking that's being done. Because for those who are able to invest, they're worried about the fact that I'll invest here, build a beautiful road, build a beautiful home, whatever it is, right? And then in a couple of months, a rebel group or military group will come in and take over it, and then I lose my investment, right? And so that's the second component where I would say that exists. Mining conditions as well, similarly, right? Um, it's beneficial towards particular companies because the fact of there being military, being violence and conflict means that it's harder to track what's coming in and what's going out, right? And so there's less trace, there's less capacity for the government to be able to know, okay, this is what's being done in the mines, this is what's being really extracted, right? And so in some terms, there is a profit-making scheme that happens with there being militarization in one end. The second part of it is the fact that for some other ends, it becomes an exploitative thing where military groups will and factions will take control of a mine and hold it hostage, right, towards their own means and have payment from that, right? Um, just to wrap this up, I think with that said, it's also important to always think about the fact that these mines have also, in one way or another, financed these military actions. Right, there are groups that continue to finance their activities by having control of mines. Right, so it's a vast way to look at it. DRC at some point did have one of the largest group of child soldiers. I think it may still do at this point in time. And just in terms of the data that is available, that's the other thing, right? There's a gap in the data, right? And so it's been quite interesting that way.
Yeah, as you were saying this, it made me think of similar conditions in Sudan, for example, where the
Hmm.
militarization of these productive activities, whether mining or
Hmm.
agriculture or things like that, is this militarization and how it then gets out of this country and into a supply chain, then kind of
Hmm.
hides. It's like this gap that presents a barrier
Yes.
between whether in information or ability to change or control conditions
Yes.
from everything that comes before that. So in the case of
Hmm.
Sudan, you have, for example, Arabic or gold mining in RSF-controlled
Hmm.
areas, agriculture, things like that. And then through these RSF-controlled routes, they make their way into whatever, the Gulf, other places,
Yes.
India. The conditions under which this was mined and the conditions under which it was brought to a different place are
Yes.
essentially hidden from the view of the rest of
Yes.
this world. My next question takes us towards, I think, the most difficult thing that I want you to bring us closer to, which is
Yes.
what next? Where do we go from here? And I think in the wake of this, of M23's taking of Goma, but also in previous iterations, there have been a lot of calls in the media for the Western world to put pressure on Paul Kagame to stop supporting M23. This is an allegation that Kagame to date has denied. He's denied that Rwanda is arming M23 or that Rwandan troops are on the ground in DRC. Other, forms of documentation, other groups have provided evidence to the contrary. But in all of this, I think this is a particularly complicated history that when presented with kind of simple headlines that mainstream media often give, especially when it comes to Congo, it can feel like it's reduced to a very simple fix. But I wanted you to kind of, talk us through this. There's a Guardian op-ed that was published last year by Baba Tampa. So Tampa writes, with
Hmm.
low-key condemnations of the murderous violence in DRC, Kagame's patrons in London and Washington disgracefully continue to fund Kagame's regime, including his brutal Rwanda Defense Force, or RDF, and block the creation of an international criminal tribunal for DRC to end the impunity enabling the violence. The conflict in DRC is different from those in Sudan, Ukraine, and Yemen. There's no Russian or Chinese influence on the ground or veto at the UN Security Council, and there's never been any threat to US, British, European, or Canadian citizens or interests. What is happening in DRC is perhaps the only conflict in the world that the international community could resolve relatively simply, costing British, US, or EU taxpayers almost nothing. And because we can do so, we must. End quote. So I'd like you to speak on this. I mean, I think obviously this is coming from a place of frustration,
Hmm.
exasperation, of the world standing by as this has continued, not just for years, but for decades. But I think there is also a tendency, at least those in the global public who aren't familiar with this very complicated history,
Hmm.
to simplify this as well. Obviously, this is, what's happening in Congo is not going to
Hmm.
end by changing one actor, Paul Kagame. So I'd just like you to kind of talk about this and take as long as you want. It's a big thing, but is there
Hmm.
truth in the charge that pressuring Kagame would change the game? And if so, why is the West hesitant to put more pressure on Rwanda? And lastly, and perhaps very importantly, what do you think of the idea that the conflict in the DRC is, quote, perhaps the only conflict in the world that the international community could resolve relatively simply?
Those are big questions. Yeah, so I think it's complex, right? I think the tendency for the global community is usually you want to know who the heroes are, and who the villains are, and who needs to be saved, right? It's very much in a very black and white, or there's no gray in between, right? And with the DRC conflict, there's a lot of gray, right? And so if you take an approach that's very black and white, then you lose it on the nuances that are the complexities, of course, right? Um, on a general scale, do I think that the Western powers and global community pressuring Kagame and Rwanda as a whole to stop supporting M23 could help the situation? Um, I think it could in the short term. right? I think it has demonstrated capacity to do so before, right? There have been negotiations, accords from which there has been peace for some certain time, or like 6 months, peace maintained for some time. The challenge is, right, the fact that what needs to really be addressed is the vacuum that happens once this peace comes into play, right? Because M23 came into this space to fill in a vacuum that was already positioned by rebels before them, right? And so it's a war that's been going on for 30 years. It's a conflict that's been going on for 30 years. The names of different actors may change in some ways, right? But the quote unquote game stays the same, right? So I do think pressuring and given proof of the fact that there have been RDF support towards AFC, pressuring Kagame to do something about it may bring people to the table faster for two reasons, right? Do I think Kagame himself is involved? I can't tell, right? It would be hard to for something to happen under Kagame's roof without him knowing, given his leadership style, right? But at the same time, it's fairly possible that this is something that's being managed by other key players with less involvement from Kagame. There's no direct link you can make to Kagame himself as the person behind this, right? Um, but at the same time, he has the power as the leader of Rwanda to be able to stop particular parties from doing particular action. That's the basis of that. It's also important to note that Kagame, among the African leaders on the continent, is perhaps one of the strongest, right? In terms of personality, in terms of leadership style, in terms of global relations, in terms of global influence, right? And continental influence. Maybe that might change with what's happening now, but Kagame does have a stake in the say in things. I do recall, for example, in the African Union discussions, Kagame's voice and sayings swaying how people move towards particular decisions or not, right? In a similar way, I think in this space, given his capacity as a leader, he has the capacity to pull things together to make sure that peace is found in DRC and in the Great Lakes region as an extension, right? So I do think there's capacity to put pressure on Kagame to be part of this, negotiation, to be part of this peacemaking effort in a genuine sense, right? Do I think pressure should be put on Kagame alone? No, right? I think that Vava Tampa does highlight one thing about the US or EU taxpayers. I think EU and US taxpayers need to also apply pressure, and the global community apply pressure on their leaders to also stop being self-interested. Because to me, it's ludicrous to imagine that for the past 30 years, a country like Rwanda by itself, right, with the GDP it has and the money, the profit, the capacity financially it has, cannot fund a war for 30 years by itself. It's absolutely ludicrous, right? And so my view is that Kagame has potential to bring things to the table and make due to bring peace to the country and bring peace to the region. But it should also not be a situation where Kagame becomes a scapegoat, right? Whether or not we look at Gaddafi or Babo in Cote d'Ivoire and Ivory Coast, right? Uh, European powers have used leaders as scapegoats, right? And so this is not to try and build some conspiracy theory for those who are pro M23 or not, but it's a fact of in this situation, you must also think about the fact that European and American players are trying to put the eggs in the best basket that will have the best outcome, right? So in this situation, they're both publicly denouncing Rwanda and Kagame, right, and showing support towards DRC and wanting peace, but on the back end, still financing Rwandan backed support for M23, right? In a way that makes it that if Rwanda becomes a villain publicly, they can drop and say, "Hey, we denounced Rwanda," right? And in that ability, still be the good guys, quote unquote, in public view. And if it doesn't happen, and that things continue, and Rwanda gets the upper standing, then or Rwandan support M23 gets the upper standing, and they've been financing them, they still have that relationship there, right? In a way that is physical for them. So for me, there's a keynote to begin to expand, if we're going to talk in black and white terms, the villains of the story to go beyond Kagame, right? so that we're very clear on the other actors, so that when the next peace accord happens, we're able to sustain it, right? Um, why is the West hesitant to put pressure on Rwanda? Because the West is guilty. Like, I think that question is a very simple answer, right? And it's one of the reasons how Kagame is able to indulge influence and able to indulge some form of independence for Rwanda, right? France can't talk, right? France can't be as vocal because during the process to the genocide and through the genocide and at the end of genocide, they supported pro-genocide parties, right? At the time, French parties invested about 14.5 million US dollars into pro-genocide parties in 1993. I think in the 1992-1993, the genocide center in Kigali shows this, right? And then there's been stories and recounts of French military coming into spaces of Tutsi hideouts and telling them it's safe to come out, only for them to then be killed by pro-genocide parties, right? Interhamwe. Lastly, the French, for example, orchestrated Operation Turquoise, right? An operation that basically provided a channel for those who committed the genocide in Terhamwe. And a part of the reason of why this motivation for Rwandan-backed forces to enter into Congo exists is because this Operation Turquoise allowed for Hutu and Terhamwe to enter into Congo with their finances, with their money, with their weapons, with all their resources, right? And so they continued what they're orchestrating in Rwanda, in the DRC. And then that provided the momentum and impetus for the RDF, for the rebel groups, to then go into Congo, right, and push the support for Uganda and Rwanda to support someone like Laurent Kabila into becoming president, right? So there's all this that's involved in that, but it's also the fact of your bystanding behavior in the past gives enough momentum for you to then have your hands tied in some way, because like, why are you acting now? In 1993 and 1994 you didn't act, right? Like, what's so there's a guilt in that aspect, right? um there's also the fact of like you're benefiting from it, just plain and simple, right? That in the way that it works right now, going through these particular channels where you don't have to necessarily pay tax on some particular things you're extracting, countries like Switzerland, right, are benefiting from the exploitation of DRC minerals and resources without having to do the due diligence and the payments that need to require to develop those countries, those areas in the country, right? Um, I disagree with Vava Tampa that this is a conflict we could resolve relatively simple, like in a relatively simple way, right? I think we could start to resolve in a relatively simple way by it's relatively simple for taxpayers outside of the African continent to resolve this in a simple way, right? By holding the leaders accountable to supporting the reconciliation of the region, right? But this is a domino effect and a blowback of actions have been taken since 1956, at least, right? And so if you have over 50 years worth of actions have been happening that have at some point the war in Congo was called the Africa War, the Africa War, right? Because it involved over 50 different African countries in DRC, right? And so there's still all these threads of attachment, right? You have countries like South Africa, you have Angola, Mozambique, even Zimbabwe to a certain extent during the early 2000s was involved in the DRC war, right? Whether it's for mineral exploitation or for political standing or geopolitical powers, right? And so to resolve this conflict and bring peace to DRC, we have to think about all these other actors and how do we reconcile all of that, and how do we also go above and beyond and put the resources aside and think about humanity, right now we're thinking about everyone's thinking in this particular year. I think the strategy is me first, we'll figure everyone else out after, right? And it's become very insular, very internal, and in some ways xenophobic, right? Which means we think about our profit and our benefit first, then we don't think collectively as a group. That needs to change, right? And that needs to come through in a different way. um, I think Vava's motivation saying it can be simply solved is more encouraging external parties to realize that you don't necessarily have to do as much and it won't affect your economy in the way you think it will, right? You won't, by supporting peace in DRC, you're not going to lose out, you're not going to be taxed more There isn't a direct economical trade-off that happens if you support DRC peace as opposed to saying nothing, right? So the simplicity in how you engage and support is relatively there. The simplicity of resolving it, I don't think so, right? Because we resolve M23 and the conflict with them, but there's 120 rebel groups at least in the DRC. How do we resolve the conflict with each one of them to be able to move Congo forward? And that's, I think, is more primarily looking at the leadership gap we have.
As you were speaking about another name for this conflict being the Africa War, which I hadn't heard of before,
Hmm.
it just made me think
Hmm.
of this as in a way, a sort of darkened version of the Pan African dream of the '60s. You know, it's
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
same way that Congo was the heart of the Pan African project in many ways. Um, it's the way that things turned out, the effects of foreign intervention, the dynamics of capitalism and extraction from African countries, and also the different political leaders who have come to power in African countries as a result of how decolonization played out or didn't play out, has kind of led us to, in a way, the situation that we're in now. For example, we're in Kenya. You have Ruto, who, far from any kind of real Pan Africanism, is kind of just in DRC kind of
Yes.
for the loot as well. And
Hmm.
it is the conflict as it exists now is made possible because of where different African countries ended up on the path after independence. And
Hmm.
I think what we're seeing now is kind of, an inversion of that dream. There's something that I wanted to hold on that you mentioned earlier in your answer, which is about this idea um, of vacuums. And I think that's a key point that we need to touch on as we continue to think about where we go from here. I think you're very right to say that the cost for action for people outside of Congo, outside of Africa, is very little, and so whatever little should be done and whatever simple solutions there are should be done and with full force. But when it comes to then now at a more granular level, let's say after the next peace accord, when you're
Hmm.
talking about this vacuum that exists, I just wanted to kind of zoom in on this and for you to kind of give us a better sense, perhaps in past times that this has happened, or just how you'd like to explain it. What does that vacuum look like when there is let's not say peace, but the lack of fighting at least in a particular in Eastern Congo, in the Great Lakes region? What are some of the things that tend to happen? Who are some of the players that come in? How has this played out in the past? And perhaps that will help illuminate then what needs to be broken in order for this cycle to not continue.
Yeah. So the M23 formation comes from the name itself is from the March 23rd, 2009. That's what it's named after, the agreement that was made in 2009, right? When that previous rebel group was stopped, they promised to pardon them and to absorb them as part of the national army in DRC, right? And so they tried it out and it didn't quite work for multiple reasons, right? One, the investment towards the national army in DRC is not that they should, but the investment is at a low level, right? Military persons who are not of higher grade were receiving $150 per month, right, as their salary, right, which doesn't really advance, right? If you have a family of 4 kids and you want to take them to school and you want to do a couple other things, $150 is ludicrous to live with, right? So the conditions weren't favorable, right? And so you've put people in a space where they were potentially going to earn more as rebel groups and like and have a bigger benefit, quote unquote, right? And perhaps see a better life, and then brought them into this space where you've promised them a particular aspect of life and then failed to deliver, right? It's also the reason why, in some cases, like in Bukavu, army military men ran away from the fight because it's like I'm not being motivated enough to survive this, right? Like you haven't shown me the proper leadership to show that you care about the country. You haven't paid me enough to be able to sustain myself, so I'm dying for $150 per month. Right. It doesn't really. Whereas somebody who's in parliament, big bellied, tie suit, knows nothing about strategy or war or army is earning close to $20,000 per month, right? And so this was ludicrous because you continue to see the biggest challenge for me is the fact that yes, there's a war happening right now, but the vacuum continues to exist because we have a leadership gap, right? Most recently, one of the Minister of Defense, right, publicly made two speeches that were literally copy paste speeches verbatim from movies. Right, one based off Winston Churchill's speech, just change the United Kingdom to or the Great Britain to the DRC, but literally word for word, right, where the speeches made from these movies, right. So you have examples like this, where there's like a leadership fallacy. You have rebel groups that are intruding onto people's peace and situation and stability, and then you have a community where things are not moving forward, right? I always used to joke about my hometown when I was a kid and say that my mother and father left DRC at some point in 1995, right? Through this bridge that had been there in 1995. It's been changed now, but I think this was changed like 2015. But between 1995 and 2015, this bridge that connects Bukavu to Changugu had never been modified, right? Never been done a touch up on. Like maybe they put a few planks in it, but it was a wooden creaky bridge. And to me, that's the spirit that's there, right? It's the fact of like we're not pushing ourselves hard enough to be able to move our country forward as Congolese people, right? In the granular sense, it then means thinking about what are the causes that push people to then become rebels, right? What are the desires? What is really that gap, right? One is who's financing it and why are they financing it, right? And how do we stop it, right? Two is providing the appropriate infrastructure that it doesn't make it tempting for somebody to join a rebel group, right? Um, in a hard way to say, but it's harder to get people to join rebel groups when they're comfortable, right? Or to do anything out of the norm when they're comfortable. People aren't comfortable, people aren't healthy, people aren't prospering. Because of that, they're able to join and able to consider and support these groups, right? Um, and they've seen the power and advancement that they're able to have with that. Um, the question about the vacuum is really hard, though, right? Um, because the other thing I don't understand is that there's a power struggle there, but there's also a violent struggle, right? We have the challenge we're now looking at, for example, the impact on women and children, right? Of not only is there a need for a Truth and Justice Reconciliation Committee, but there's also a rehabilitation need, right? Pansy Foundation has done quite some work with women who've been affected by violence in their communities and in conflict. Uh, but what happens to these communities who have seen trauma, have experienced violence, have lost at a great devastating level, right? The DRC, for example, has lost from 1995 to now over 7 million people, right? Due to just conflict, right? Um, in thinking about that, where do these communities go back to, and how do we guarantee, right, that they will be safe in those spaces? Those are the vacuums that need to be filled up in order to ensure that when the next rebel idea comes through, it isn't picked up and ran with, right? On the other end, I do think it's important that we begin to think about how do we build better and foster better relationships with our neighbors and other African countries, right? So that they too can also be genuinely invested in protecting the peace and prosperity of DRC as part of their profit, right? It's unfortunate, but one of our leaders in the past, Mobutu, did form quite distrusting relationships as wanting to be the political hegemon of the African continent, um, that led to what we now have as the consequences, right? But in those actions, you can trace M23 all the way back up to the history of Simba Mulele in the 1970s, which was another rebel group that was creating tension and disaster across DRC, right? And so there's been several different rebel groups for every generation. So every generation has its own. Like, yeah, we grew up to M23, we grew up to Mai Mai, we grew up to Azalendo, we grew up to Simba Mulele. Like, there's been a wave and wave and wave of rebel groups that come and terrorize and fill that vacuum up. And what's happening is that we need to fill the vacuum up before the rebel groups do that.
My final question is a kind of an open one. Is
Mhm.
there something important that you feel, something as in whether an aspect of this conflict or voices and perspectives or anything at all topically, is there something or some things that you feel are very important but which are too often left out of this global discourse about what's happening in Congo?
I think Congolese people are pushing more and more for this, and I think the first so there's I think two main points and maybe a third. The first is agency and humanity, right, in the story, and the second is the day after. I'd put it as that way, right? The day after peace, right? The first is looking at the fact that um, even though there is admittedly a gap in the data of like what's happening in the DRC, like the data I would say is quite out of date even today, right? Even with the M23 details, there's data that's quite out of date, right? Which is a gap that needs to be addressed as well. But even with that, a lot of the history on DRC has always spoken to things very statistical. Like we have stats and data on like 7,000 displaced, a million displaced, and like we begin to lose the humanity in the story of like and the events that are happening and see things as just numbers, right? And remembering that these are people, these are human beings with proper lives who are um, losing a ton, whether it's life, their children, their space, their environment, and how devastating that can be, right? I think the Congolese people are doing that in a lot of different ways, and I think that there is. I'd spoken to this in a different discussion before. There's a lot of lessons we can take from the effort of Palestinians in the movement to see the liberation of Gaza and the peace, right, and Palestine as a whole, in the way they've been able to translate and show the humanity of Palestinians, as sad as it is that you have to show that you are human in order for somebody else to invest in supporting and being in solidarity with you, I think it's key that we continue to show the humanity that exists and the resilience that is there, right? To invite people into that, and I think Congolese, both in the country and outside, are pushing to show that humanity in different ways, alongside the protests and the events, the movement that they're making at work. That would be the first point. The second point is more to think about the day after, right? Um, I think for DRC we found ourselves in the liberation curse. You know, there's the resource curse, but I think there's a liberation curse, right? One that is quite adamant of when we think about independence movements, right? A lot of African countries had a very promising trajectory when we talk about like how they fought for independence and what they had envisioned for independence. And then the day after independence, things go left again, right? And then we find ourselves back in the cycle of like now we must fight for liberation, must fight for a better Africa, must fight for, and then we get to a point where like okay, we're almost there, we get there, and we fall back into the cycle again, right? And so breaking that cycle by being able to also begin to imagine and also begin to be very concrete about what the day after peace will be, right? And being able to add that to the narrative, right? Because I think that also helps people begin to imagine better, right? It's a fact of like we talk a lot about indoctrination in terms of the work that was done in Nazi Germany. We could talk about it in terms of Mao Zedong, right? Like in terms of how education was used to control a people and its mind and what they thought, right? I would say in a similar way that conflict and the impact of conflict has indoctrinated people to be in some ways complacent with the idea that conflict is always going to be there, right? And can sometimes bar people from thinking about like, okay, what would it look like if we didn't have conflict? What do we need? And talk about this at a larger scale, right? When you talk about DRC, one of the first things and only things people talk about is, oh, you have a lot of resources, but you also have a lot of war. Like the people are poor. Like that. Those come in hand, and it is true. But I think that we need to start pushing beyond that to start talking about like, okay, if there was to be peace in Congo, we have a peace agenda and a peace strategy that looks at like, okay, we're going to achieve A, B, C, D items, and some of those particularly are looking at health systems and access and provisions, infrastructure, right? The fact that there's an article I'm working on with a friend that speaks to this, and hopefully will be launched at some point. But if Rwanda and Burundi were to close its borders today, right, to North and South Kivu, it would take people at least 2 days, 3 days to get to a reasonable place to run away from the violence or the war in North and South Kivu at the moment, right? Essentially making it a kill box, right, of a situation, right? Even though some of the distances in that particular region is a distance that's equivalent to Nairobi to Mombasa, right? Which in some cases should take about 6 hours to 8 hours, not even a half a day, right? But because the lack of infrastructure, the lack of infrastructural systems and access means that it becomes almost impossible to navigate through the DRC, right? I'm not just talking about going from east to west, but just like even from east to south, right? Just absolutely incredible that we have that gap existing, right? We need good leadership. And what does good leadership look like, right? We need accountability systems in place. What does that really look like, right? We need development and innovation, and we need a good education system, right? Particularly because I think the education system then helps us continue to build generations of young Congolese who have the capacity to continue innovating and to be able to support that, right? We have stifled innovation in the DRC. We really have, right? And that is a big part of that is to do with our leadership and how it works, right? We need to address corruption, right? Corruption is it's hard to say, but corruption is hard to kill entirely. But we need to put it to a level where things can be conducive for development, right? You have this too many stories I know of, too many examples, too many reports of how people have come with innovative ideas and have gotten funding for it. Like, let's for example, give you an example of somebody may come and have funding for 10 millions to implement a particular project in DRC that is to create a road, right, or something like that, right? And in that 10 million, government or administration banks will ask them for 4 million of it before even starting the project, right? And so with behaviors like that, we are immediately discouraging the development of our country for the benefit of the countrymen and the countrywomen, right? Um, and then what we create as rhetoric is the only way to advance in the country is either to steal or to join politics and steal in politics, which is why in our most recent elections you had thousands and thousands of people running for electoral posts because that's the only guaranteed way of making money and having a job in DRC at the moment because we've stifled all other sectors, right? We need a Pan African collaboration, right? And a true one that is really looking at how do we make sure that, yes, Congo is a resource rich area that has a lot that different people could profit from. But how do we make it so that as DRC profits, others can see the benefits of DRC profiting in order for them to profit? Some of the arguments talk about the DRC Rwanda dynamic is the fact that because DRC is so huge, if it prospers, Rwanda won't be able to prosper or compete with it, right? So we need to move from a point of you're my competitor to you're my collaborator and complementer, right? Those are a few of the things I think that we need to start looking at and talking about, and at least imagining as a community in Congo, as a community globally, and working towards saying, okay, these are the steps we're going to take concretely when we come into, so that we're all on the same plane. So when peace arrives this time around, we know what are the vacuums we need to fill.
To wrap this up, are there any resources, books, names of people who have written articles, or anything that you would recommend for people who want to continue understanding not only what has happened before in history, what's happening now, but to kind of tune in on some of these things that you just mentioned, these other frequencies that aren't so well captured in the
Mm.
mainstream discourse?
So some that come to mind. It's unfortunate again. This comes to the thing of access and education, right? There's two parts to this. One is the fact that because DRC is a francophone speaking country, a French speaking country, a lot of the content is usually based in French, right? Than in English. But there's some things available in that if you do go into a French search stream that you can find generally. Um, the people that come to mind from what I've read, right? I'm speaking specifically from what I've read and what I continue to read. If you want a foundation on basically understanding the complexities and intricacies of DRC historically, people like Jason K. Stern's book, Dancing in the Glory of Monsters. A very grim title, but really takes enough time to really explain the connections and intricacies from the genocide all the way through to the end of, I think, the Second Congo War, right? And gives you some context on like who are the key players, how did Mobutu affect it. There's another writer called Gérard Prunier. I think his book is called Congo, right? And he also takes a very extensive looking at from Liberation Point, the Lumumbas, the Joseph Kasavubus, all the way through to what we know as Congo and the wars we've been experiencing for the past 30 years. Those are like academic books, but they give kind of like a very in-depth, thick way of doing it. Um, personally, someone who I enjoy, because they also give a bit more connections that include like oral histories and things that are not always captured in the news, is a historian who actually has his own website, but most of his stories are available on Twitter or X, called Benjamin Babunga Watuna. And so Benjamin Babunga Watuna is quite disciplined in this, but every tries to post every day a moment in DRC history, right? And so he'll do a thread that's about like 15 threads long, and will explain like the creation of a particular situation, why it happened, who are the stakeholders involved, what led to it, and what came from it, right? And so you begin to join the dots across history in a way that's pretty intricate and pretty interesting, right? For example, he explains the um why there's a belief in some rebel groups having supernatural powers, right? And where that comes from, right? But explains it based on the killing of one woman in Simba Mulile, right? And draws the connections very well. So I really enjoy his work in that way. You've mentioned Vava Tampa. There's I'm forgetting Adam Kabombo. There is some work that's coming out on the Republic right now, Republic Nigeria, that's been edited by Nicole Batumike from Pansy Foundation. That's a series of explanations on like the Congo War, but also on the effect of mining in DRC. Uh, who else am I forgetting? The future of Congo. Goma Active, definitely. They give different context on like basically what's happening on the ground, news as well. Um, One thing I will say is also because of culture and dynamics, as opposed to like some English speaking countries where you read stuff off the Guardian, a lot of the information you get has to also be verified, but usually comes through social media, right? In DRC, right? You get more news quicker, whether you're on the uncle WhatsApp groups or on Twitter, than you do like reading the Guardian. Like sometimes I say that the Guardian's about 2 weeks late to what's happening on the continent, right? Stuff like that. But those are a few sources I have, and then I'm always happy to share some more as it comes through. But I would definitely recommend reading some more Vava Tampa. He's really put out some work, and I think for the English community, he's a good place to start and then launch off and see what are other resources available.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
And thank you so much for your generosity and time in explaining
thank you.
all these things and bringing our attention to sort of frequencies that we might not otherwise have kept.
Thank you very much, April. Appreciate it.